everyone. We are starting our new unit, Unit 4, and our Unit 4 focuses on learning. Today we're doing 4.1 classical conditioning, which is how we're going to or determine the components of classical conditioning after analyzing a series of examples. So in other words, classical conditioning is when you pair two things together repeatedly, which causes learning, and we're going to take a look at exactly how that happens today. So first, I want you to imagine that it is this beautiful hot day at the beach. The water is crystal clear, the sand is beautiful and white, and you have been sitting out in that hot sun for some time. And you decide that you want to walk into the water, and then you hear, what is the first thing that you think of? Many of you may have said Jaws and giant sharks, and then you don't want to be in the water anymore. Why did that happen? Why did we automatically think Jaws when we hear that song? Well, it's because those two things have been paired together so many times that now we automatically think sharks whenever we hear that song. So, learning is when we learn to adapt to our environments. Oh, that's not going to help us out any. There we go. So, learning means that you adapt to your environment. And associated learning is when you link two events together. In this case, it's going to be the song plus shark. So this is our friend the sea slug. We talked about the sea slug before. We're going to talk about the sea slug again. We like the sea slugs because they have a basic nervous system, but it's similar to our own, so it's easy to study. So we're talking about learning today, and most importantly, we're talking about associative learning, or pairing two things together. So there's been a lot of studies with the sea slug and pairing things together, and we learned a couple cool things. The first thing that we learned is one that people tend to habituate. And this is important to know when you're learning something, right? Is that they may stop responding to a stimulus after repeated exposure. So what we see in the sea slug is that during rough waters, we see the sea slug respond at the beginning. So if the sea slug was in the ocean and the ocean was really rough, the sea slug would prepare itself and respond. But after a while of being in the rough ocean, the sea slug stops responding because it becomes used to it. It becomes almost comfortable. But that isn't always the case. In this case, the sea slug has learned to adapt, or in other words, habituate. However, we did find that if you pair a squirt of water with a shock, so you squirt and shock, squirt and shock, squirt and shock, then what we notice is that the sea slug does not habituate and still responds. And what we find is it becomes more protective. So what we've discovered thanks to the sea slugs is that we don't just learn by pairing two things together. We're going to talk about that in this case, and we're going to talk about associative learning. However, we do believe that there's a cognitive aspect to learning. That in addition to pairing things together, you are also processing information at the same time. So classical conditioning was developed by a man by the name of Ivan Pavlov, and we've talked about him before. And he actually discovered this on accident when he was testing dogs. When he was studying how dogs salivate. And we'll talk about the actual experiment here in a minute. And essentially what he learned, or what he discovered, was that this behavior is learned. And so he was a behaviorist. Him, and we'll also talk about John B. Watson in a little bit later in this unit. So Pavlov was a behaviorist. He believed that behavior was learned, and he figured that on accident by studying how dogs salivate. And what he realized with classical conditioning is that it is a type of learning through which an organism learns to associate one stimulus with another. And just a reminder, a stimulus is any event or object in the environment which an organism responds. So let's see exactly how he did this. How did this happen? So what he realized is that every time the people who came in to feed the dogs entered the room, even when they just entered the room, the dogs would start to get excited and they would salivate, which he thought was fascinating. He realized that the dogs must have learned that these people mean food. So he decided to run a study. So what he did was he gave the dogs food, which we call the unconditioned stimulus. And what he realized is that when you give them food, they had an unconditioned response. Unconditioned, and we'll say this again, I'll repeat it multiple times, means unlearned. So if I were to bring out a nice warm pizza right now, you'd probably salivate because that is just your automatic response. It is unlearned. So then Pavlov took a bell, which we call a neutral stimulus, meaning that there's no response for it. And we rang the bell, and the dog had no response, which is what we would expect. So then what he did was he took and he paired the bell, which was our neutral stimulus, with the food, which was an unconditioned stimulus. And what he realized is if he paired these two things together at the same time, what he would get is dogs salivating. Ring bell, give food. Ring bell, give food. Ring bell, give food. You do this over and over and over again. So we'll put repeat. So after you repeat that, which we call conditioning, right? Then what happens is that the dog has learned, we call this conditioned, which means the dog has learned to salivate. at the bell. So now the dog doesn't need food anymore. All it needs is the bell, and it will learn to salivate because in that dog's mind, the bell means food. The dog has been conditioned. Okay, so the same example in a little bit of a different format. These first two pictures is before conditioning. So this is before learning occurs. We should say before. So before learning, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, and it produces an unconditioned response, which is to salivate. And again, unconditioned means unlearned. Then we take a neutral stimulus, which is the bell, and you have no response, which is good. That's what you want to see happening. If it causes a response, it's no longer a neutral stimulus. So then what we do is we pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. The US is repeatedly presented. So it means happens multiple times. And this causes the unconditioned response, which is to salivate. Once the behavior is learned, all you need is the conditioned stimulus, then what happens is the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, which then causes the conditioned response or the learned response. So essentially, classical conditioning is when you condition, or in other words, learn a reflex. So today, what we discussed is just a basic principle of classical conditioning, and that is taking and pairing things together repeatedly until what used to be an unlearned response becomes learned.